Hello, everyone, and good morning. If you're here in Asia, I guess good morning. If you're someone who's joining us from the US, I put it out there that this is relatively available for US people. Good evening. Thanks for joining us for this next Process Alpha webinar. A happy New Year, happy Lunar New Year to everyone in Asia who's had the Lunar New Year holiday within the last week. So today we're going to have a follow-on session from our last webinar, the setting up the problem. So fundamentally, we're talking last time about the importance of making sure you're asking the right question in your portfolio construction process so that you can get the right answer. And so today we're going to take a little bit more quantitative lens on analyzing the impact your constraints have on your portfolio outcomes. So today, again, we're going to be about 30 minutes. Plus or minus. We have a lot of content to get through today. We'll plan to do questions at the end, but certainly if you have questions midstream and you just can't begin to sit on them, go ahead and put them in the chat on the side, and we'll get to them midstream if we can. Otherwise, expect about 30 minutes. Expect questions at the end, and we will, if you have to duck out midway through, have this online on the Sherpa Process Alpha YouTube page later today as a replay. So if you have to duck out, just check out the YouTube page and you can get the rest of the session then. So again, my name is Stephen Quimby. My colleague and CEO, Richard Waddington, is joining us today. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll go ahead and kick it off. So today we're going to be talking about the impact of your constraints. Richard, do you have the slide?
Yep, sorry.
That's okay. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to review a tool that we've talked about previously, which is the candidate portfolios analysis. And so the candidate portfolio analysis is something that we've used from after the fact, or sort of a performance analysis at how good is your portfolio perspective. But fundamentally, this is a tool we can use to talk about the outcomes that are possible from a given portfolio definition. And so we're going to then use that candidate portfolio analysis to show, both in a visual and in a numeric sense, the impact of changing different parts of your portfolio shape definition, so different line item constraints. And then we're going to go through a series of different constraints to show that this is an important thing to tackle quantitatively. And this is an important thing to think consciously about, because practically speaking, most PMs don't really know the impact of their constraints. And as we'll see, they're not necessarily intuitive. And then so finally, we'll take that and we'll sort of wrap it all together and see how you can use this to actually make better decisions to put yourself in a better set of possible outcomes for your portfolio. So as we talk about this, like I just mentioned, most PMs don't even really know how their different constraints impact their portfolio. And as we talked about in the previous webinar, when we talked about our 3 C's framework, complete, coherent, and consistent for evaluating constraints, practically speaking, many of these constraints are soft constraints. So those are constraints put on by the PM, or constraints or views that they maybe have about a sector tilt or about how much concentration they're comfortable having, that have a certain amount of flexibility. And then there are hard constraints imposed externally that really can't move. And if you don't know what those constraints really mean in terms of how your portfolio could play out, then you're flying blind a little bit in terms of how you set those up, or you're uninformed when you're talking to your boss or your investors about really what constraints they're putting on you and what that means for the outcome that they're going to realize with their capital. So today we're going to talk about a new framework using our candidate portfolios analysis to show how you can quantify this. So as a simple review, remember that the candidate portfolio analysis involves generating a large number of eligible portfolios that use the same asset selections, the same ideas, the same alpha input, and the same portfolio shape definition, the same objectives and constraints, to show the spread of possible outcomes. And so this is something that helps a PM understand, for how I've set up my problem and for what my views are that are going into the problem, what could I have done? And so previously we've discussed this mostly in the context of looking at it after the fact to say, how good was my asset selection? How good was my sizing? How good was my scoring? But what we're going to talk about today is that we can use this to illustrate the impact of different shaping decisions. So we can use this to show how this changes as we, say, increase the maximum asset size for our strongest conviction ideas, or change constraints on region or something in that area. And so by analyzing these different shapes, it gives us a clear idea about really how we want to put the portfolio together, how we want to shape it, which decisions we want to take. So today we're going to use a portfolio data set. Again, this is anonymized, live, sort of real Sherpa client data. We're going to be talking about a long only 45-ish asset benchmarked long equity portfolio. And so if we look at this data set, this is an actual analysis of this data set. The benchmark relative return here was 13%. They were taking strong risk and paid off well, good alpha during this period. Sherpa moved it up to about 14.5%, which represents a move from about the median, about the average 50th, 47th in this case percentile to the 75th. So this is a case where clearly there's alpha in these ideas, and clearly there's a better way to express that alpha. But as we'll see as we walk through this, the PM had many choices that they could make that could have shifted how this would have worked out by putting different constraints on this data, by putting different constraints on their assets. So what we're going to talk about today, a few simple metrics, and these are metrics I talk about with clients as sort of an after-the-fact review of what was possible for a given portfolio, and to really help, again, measure the impact of their portfolio construction process. So the first one we'll talk about is simply out of this distribution of possible candidate portfolios, what's the median or the average portfolio return? So this is going to give us an idea of the direction of possible outcomes and whether or not there is sort of positive alpha potentially in the ideas. Then we're going to talk about the spread of potential returns. And so you'll notice here that we've trimmed off the far tails. So the 100th percentile and the 0th percentile are less interesting to us than in this case, the 90th percentile versus the 10th, or in the fatter part of the distribution, the 75th percentile versus the 25th percentile. And so this shows a realistic metric about how much room there is to improve. If we talk about a good portfolio taking us from the 40-something percentile to the 75th percentile, or if we say you could, by putting bad portfolio composition together, drop all the way down to the 25th, this helps quantify what that actually means. We'll also talk a little bit about some traditional risk and return statistics. And there are, of course, many more complicated ways, more statistically sophisticated ways to describe this distribution. But that's not going to be the topic for today's webinar because we've got enough on our plate already. So to consider how this works, we're going to look at just a simple example. So we're going to take this same portfolio and we're going to vary the two things that almost every PM we work with has as levers at their disposal that they can modify, that they can choose, that they can take an active view on in setting up their portfolio. So the first of these is the maximum asset weight. So that's to say for your highest conviction ideas, how much size can you have in those ideas? And then the second is the level of risk. So that's to say, how much risk do you want to take? How much conviction do you have in your ideas to sort of load up on concentration versus focusing on more on diversification? So what we're going to do with this is build 4 different portfolios. So the first portfolio we looked at, the example was the low risk and the lower asset max size. So essentially, this is a relatively more constrained portfolio. It's one where we've tightened up the banding. So basically, it can't deviate as much as it otherwise might be able to with a larger asset max. And we're not necessarily focusing on expressing the greatest amounts of concentration in our high conviction ideas. We're more focused on mitigating risk and sort of capturing alpha in a risk controlled manner. And as we scale up, we'll then look at a medium expression of risk with a medium maximum asset weight. Then we'll flex that to a medium risk with a high amount of potential max asset weight. And then finally, we'll look at a high and a high. So high risk, high max weight. So again, using the metrics we talked about in our candidate portfolios, this is that same visualization we looked at earlier, just looking at this low risk and low max asset weight. And we can see that our median outcome here was 13.25% returns, quite good. And the spread here is relatively tight. So only 2.5% between the 75th and the 25th percentile outcome, and only a little shy of 5% between the 90th and the 10th.
And just to reiterate, because I appreciate we've had these feedback, this is not a simulation of the market. This is the actual market applied to different possible portfolios constructed from the same set of assets and being compliant with all the objectives and constraints of this portfolio.
Same actual market data.
This is an after the fact analysis of what actually the possible outcomes you could have had with those set of decisions taken back in April 2020 over the last 9 months.
Yeah.
So I just want to.
No, that's a good point. So same market data, same real path of historical market results. The difference here is just different compliant portfolios. Every one of these portfolios has the same set of stocks, the same set of scores, has the same set of constraints. So each one of these portfolios is something that, as a PM, you could have done and how they would have unfolded. So as we dial up the risk a little bit, so again, there's a relation here between dialing up the risk, allowing us to take more risk, and changing that max size so that we can have larger positions. We can see that this increases both our returns, so increases that median return up to 13.5%, but it also has a significant increase in our spreads, in our variation of potential outcomes. So we go from, call it 2.5 to 5% up to 4 to 6.25. And we do that, the median, the 50th percentile increases only by 25 basis points. So there's more ability to express or to capture the alpha as we take more risk, as we allow more flexibility, but it also allows for a greater variation in potential outcomes. Now, how far?
So, which is entirely, intuitive, right? You're taking more risk and you're giving yourself more flexibility, so you expect a wider possible set of outcomes. That's
right.
That's what we expect, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the question then, of course, is how far can you push it, right? And so if we change this and we go from the medium risk and the high maximum size, we can see that we increase the spread even further and we increase the median even further. So there's by seeking more risk, by allowing more variation, by allowing larger positions, we're able to capture more of the alpha in the ideas. But the trade-off there is that you have a wider range of outcomes depending on how you construct the portfolio. And so if we scale this all the way up and we take it to a high risk and high max size, the outcome variation expands even further. And we can see that the median return starts to drop here. So let's compare all four of these and think about why this would be. So if we compare these, we can see it intuitively, the spread should increase as we scale up the amount of variation we're allowing and as we scale up the amount of risk we're looking to take. And we can see in that first table, that's exactly what happens. So the 75th to 25th, the 90th to 10th, both of those spreads increase as we move up that chart. Now, the median return, on the other hand, from low to medium, medium to a larger size, and then high to high, scales up and then drops. So Richard, what do you think happened here?
Well, first, I think we've just lost your video, Stephen, so just check your camera.
My video, I can still see myself and see you. So audience, am I visible? Anyone in the chat?
We can hear you. We can hear you. So this is these two graphs at the top are very interesting, right? Because we go from, as we expect, as we increase the breadth of possible sizes we can take on any given asset, of course we expect the spread of possible returns to get wider. Because we have some alpha, we are getting better and better returns. That's the right-hand graph, that just with the single blue lines on it. You can see that the median candidate return by portfolio is going up and up. But beyond a certain point where we're taking more and more risk, suddenly our median return drops. And this is the key thing. So, you're back. Oh, sorry.
Audience says I was visible all the time. I think we're just technical difficulties.
So what's going on, right? What's going on? And we can think about it under many different lenses, but if we're being very technical about it, we'd say we have a certain quantum or quotient of information in our alpha, some amount of value in that alpha. And we also have some sort of variation in outcomes. And what happens is that as you increase risk, certainly your alpha, the expression of your alpha goes up, but the volatility you experience also starts going up. And there is a point at which volatility starts swamping the information in your alpha, the value in your decision making. And that this, we kind of know this intuitively. We kind of know this intuitively. If we say we are usually quite good at picking whatever, in this case it's stocks, but it could be bonds or FX or whatever, but we don't want to go in too big size because from time to time we're going to be wrong, and when we are wrong, the losses are going to be disproportionate to our to the gains we make when we're right. And this is exactly what's happening here, where we've given ourselves enough freedom to create a portfolio on the fourth example, where we have where basically our freedom has outstripped our alpha. We're quite good at picking assets, but we're not so good that we should be given that much rope. And this is at the very first level of constructing a portfolio, one of the important things, like how much risk do we want to take? How much freedom do we want with particular asset sizes? How appropriate are the decisions we've made on those two factors when we view our alpha generating capability? And again, entirely intuitive, right? Without going into any of the technical or actually doing the analysis, we would know sitting around a table that, Alice is really good at picking stocks and therefore should be given more freedom than Dave, who's okay, but therefore we should, keep Dave's risk much lower, right? That's an intuitive thing. But the purpose of the analysis is to quantify that and to make sure that once you take that intuitive step, you then have a framework for actually being able to execute on it and get the right outcome. So far, what we've talked about interacting, the interaction between your alpha quality and the amount of freedom you have in your per asset level constraints and the amount of risk you want to take at a portfolio. Those are three very different things. Alpha, which is a per asset risk identification question, per asset size constraints. So you can be, in this case, it's benchmark relative, 200 bips over or 100 bips or whatever. And then at a portfolio level, how much risk do you want to take? And we look at how these things interact. Of course, there's more than just per asset level constraints and risk. You have lots of other possible objectives and constraints when you create a portfolio. And as Stephen talked about earlier, we can sort of consider them hard constraints, things which are, on the flag that you have raised above your head to saying, this is what we do. We don't trade in, emerging markets, or we only buy stocks with a market cap more than 4 billion or whatever it might be. And then there are soft constraints, which are things that you internally decide this is the best way for us to run our business in order both to capture our alpha, to retain our clients, to provide the clients with what they like. I mean, if you sort of do the car analogy, right? I mean, the hard definitions of what a car is, shape, color, engine capacity. Is it a saloon or a pickup or a ute or a sports car, right? Those are sort of on the outside. And then there's all the stuff that's going on the inside, which the engineers have worked on, the rate, where does the piston fire and how does the engine control unit actually manage it, right? The stuff that happens inside, which the consumer doesn't really know about, and you can kind of tinker around with to make the whole thing, the whole package better. And the stuff on the outside, which you have told, yes, you are buying a blue saloon, right? Which is like, so hard constraints versus soft constraints. If we look at how constraints impact, so following on from the same type of analysis that Stephen just did, we're looking at per asset risk, per asset size and overall risk. We can look at some other ways, and don't be scared by this slide, right? But some other ways that which constraints impact the returns, the possible set of returns you're getting. And remember, you, Mr. and Miss PM, you are going to get one of those return streams, one of those green lines. You are going to experience one of those green lines, because those are all the possible green lines you can experience. which one it is depends on how you build your portfolio. What the range of those green lines is depends on how you define your constraints. So here we're going to show you 6 different sets of constraints and see how that impacts where the green lines are. And then you can, very easily understand how that then impacts the lived experience of being invested in that portfolio. So we go back to our base portfolio, which was, we'll call this M1, right? Which is the medium risk and the medium assets asset max, meaning the most size deviation to the benchmark weights for the equity guys that you can have. But basically, how big a position can you have in any given asset? And we can see, we've been through this graph, the 50th percentile of realized returns gives you 13.5, and a spread of about 4 between the 75th and 25th. If we start adding constraints to it, so in this case, the universe was about 50 assets, like 45 assets. In this set of possible portfolios, we have not said anything about how many assets you must have. So here's a list of 45, and you can pick as many or as few as you like within the asset max, etc. And it turns out you end up with about 35 assets, somewhere between 32 and 35 assets is about the right number. If you say, actually, no, you must have every asset of the 45 in there, and the minimum size of each asset must be 50 basis points, then clearly you've added a constraint. You've reduced the set of possible portfolios you can build, and the fact that you've forced it to have this, all your assets in there, ends up reducing the overall possible outcome. And your 50th percentile has dropped from 13 to about 12. But actually, interestingly, your spread has narrowed slightly. And again, if you think about that, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that's true, right? Because you have a slightly higher degree of diversification because you force yourself to have more assets. So slightly lower return, slightly tighter spread. And again, if that is your ex-ante set of constraints, you must have 50 bips, etc. Then you will live on one of those lines. Exactly which line you live on depends on how you construct your portfolio, which is the subject of many of our other webinars, and of course, what Sherpa does. If we take the same base portfolio and say, actually, not only do we construct, in this case, we've allowed you to have, you don't have to have every asset, but what you must have is, and this is a sort of emerging market portfolio, so you must have the same weighting in your portfolio as there is in the benchmark for Asian stocks versus non-Asian stocks. So in a sense, that's sort of an arbitrary split, but the PMs have decided that we want to match Asia versus non-Asia in this portfolio relative to the benchmark. Now, again, that constrains our alpha expression. You can see clearly it reduces the alpha quite a lot. We've gone from 13 and a bit to 10 and a bit. And what that's really saying is that actually the non-Asia component of the benchmark underperforms the Asia component. But in this portfolio, you have to have it, and therefore you're going to underperform. It's also because you've got a higher weight in this less correlated set of assets than on Asia, you do get a narrowing of the spread. Again, a diversification effect. Here we've added, rather than doing the regional constraint, we've said actually at a sector level, we must constrain it. So, the IT and the consumer, et cetera, must match what is in the benchmark. And again, the impact on this, we reduce the total alpha. The alpha, the asset selection was, it turns out in this case, was benchmark sector agnostic. It was like, I like these stocks, I don't like these stocks. And actually we ended up being very heavily overweight, I guess, tech in this time period. By making the sector constraint, we eliminate the possibility of being so overweight the tech, and so it brings the median experience down. But again, it broadens the diversification, so we get a narrower spread. If we take that same constraint set, so the sector and the region, and we say you have to have all 45 assets, then again, we're seeing the same thing. We are going to get a narrower spread. I mean, this is a benchmark relative, these graphs. So you're forcing yourself to be closer and closer to the benchmark, of course. Therefore, your spread gets tighter and your possible outcomes get tighter. And again, this is not unintuitive, right? We will all have a heuristic, or even better than a heuristic, sort of feeling for, by making this constraint on my portfolio, I am going to drive performance, benchmark relative performance, smaller and spread smaller. But what we don't have is an understanding, or not an intuitive understanding, of by how much. Right? So the fact that we've gone from, I think we've got the table, where is it? I'll come back to M6 in a second. The fact that we've gone in M1, which was the sort of unconstrained expression of your alpha, at a median of 13.5, to M5, where we said actually we want to be quite tight on benchmark and sector and have to have all 45 assets in. We've lost 500 basis points of possible return. Our spread has narrowed significantly, but we have lost 500 basis points of return, and that's quite significant. And really, the important thing is you can add these constraints onto yourself, but knowing how much it's possibly going to affect you is extremely hard without this sort of analysis. Now, I'm going to go back now to M6. M6 is a very interesting point. In this case, we say, actually the PM says, all those constraints, but I also, if I'm going to be in a stock, I must be 300 bips over benchmark. So I don't have to have all 45 stocks, because it's just not possible, of course. 300 times 45 is more than, you'll be over leverage, right? So I want a smaller number of stocks, and any one of the 45 that I'm in, so you end up with about 25, I need to be 300 over the benchmark on. Now, when you think about that, like, oh, that's interesting. What does that mean? It means, I'm a stronger expression of alpha. Yes, of course. But because you've got all these other constraints, it means that actually the number of possible portfolios you can build is quite sparse. Because if stock X is in, and say stock X has a benchmark of 5%, that means that stock X is either in at 8% or 0. And if it goes at 8%, it triggers lots of other constraints, which stops stock Y and Z being in. And if it goes in at 0, then stock Y and Z can be in, right? So you no longer have a sort of smooth transition between possible portfolios. When you set a constraint like this in place, you end up with a very sparse set of possible portfolios, and they are very, very different from each other. So again, we have a benchmark in this case of, I think, 1,500 stocks. We have a alpha selection of 45, and we said any stock we're in, we want to be benchmark plus 3%, meaning we end up with an eventual portfolio of about 25 to 27 stocks, which have to match at a region and a sector level. And therefore, as a result, the possibilities, the things you can be, are all extremely different from each other. Right? Each possible portfolio is extremely different from each other. You don't have a portfolio where this one's 4% and this one's 3.5%, and then another portfolio where this one's 3.5% and this one's 4%. So it's not possible, because moving this from 3.5 to 4 triggers all sorts of other stuff. Right? And as a result, you end up with this very strange looking possible set you could be on. And as a result of that, you have shifted your problem quite dramatically, right? You've actually become much more susceptible to luck than to process, because being on any one of these lines versus another one is only one very small decision at your ex-ante portfolio construction triggers you being in a very different lived experience ex post because of the way these constraints are built and interact. So M6, the one which has the you must be, if you're in, you've got to be really in, therefore you have less stocks, so therefore you expect a broader spread or less diversification. The median, well, I'm not sure the median really has much meaning because it isn't sort of an even distribution. You're as likely to be here as you are here, as you are as here as you are here. And therefore your actual lived experience becomes quite, a bit of a roll of the dice. And this idea that putting in place what sounds like quite a sensible constraint, right? I don't want my analysts and PMs to waste their time being 5 basis points in a stock. You're either in or you're not in. So you think, okay, I'm going to maximize the value of my group, of my team, of the intelligence, the information we have. Ends up having quite a large impact, or ends up introducing a level of randomness to the lived outcome that possibly is higher than you thought it would be. And again, the purpose of these analyses is not, we haven't, at no point today have we talked about how we, Sherpa, would give you the right portfolio construction, how we put you on the right one of those green paths. That's the subject of all our other webinars. The point of this is to make it so as clear as we can that when you set up your constraints, your risk constraints, your per asset constraints, your portfolio, asset type, asset class, geography, sector, whatever, and your something like we must be in at this or less. These things they interact with each other, they interact with your alpha, and they can produce variations in outcome that are very, very unintuitive, or at the very least, are very hard to intuitively quantify those outcomes. And therefore, you really need to spend a bit of time thinking about them and doing the analysis in the way that we're doing to give you some idea of how much you're impacting your future experience.
And that's, you can see on that table, Richard. I mean, the spread, like you said, if it's luck, if it's sort of random where you are because it's not really an even distribution, the spread on M6, you could basically wipe out all the alpha if you're unlucky.
Yeah, exactly. You're possible with all that work you've done on your analysis. There's just as good a chance that you'll end up on this line as there is you end up on this line. Yeah. And that's clearly not what you're trying to achieve in your business, right? We've sort of written this down here in quite long detail, so you can read this over by when you look at the webinar and your own time.
The one thing I just want to highlight on here, because we've talked about a lot of this, but when we say non-intuitive, if you as a PM told me at the start of this process that out of those 6 portfolios, you knew that the difference between 4 and 3 was trivial, and the difference between 5 and 6 was basically throw your process out the window. If you know that ahead of time, great. And maybe you have a really good feel for, well, this constraint doesn't really matter. In which case, why is it there? Maybe it's in your offering docs, maybe it's a regulatory constraint, whatever it might be, right? But it's very difficult. Some of those changes, as you change one small constraint, are very big, and some are very small. All of them make a meaningful change. All of them impact the possible future you could have, the possible things you could do with the portfolio. But how much? I mean, there's huge variation right there. Really big, really small.
So one final view, we take M5, portfolio 5, which is the one which has all the assets and is sector and regional constrained. And remember that this was the possible set of outcomes. One of the things that you can, another lever you can pull is like, well, how much active share in this case, right? How much variation at a portfolio level do I have to the benchmark? And again, the same thinking applies to macro or commodity or FX. This is just, you use slightly different words. these are all the possible portfolios. If you pick the portfolios that have low active share versus the portfolios that have high active share, you can see your possible lived-in experience changes. And again, you sort of expect it, right? Sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. The high active share, because there is positive alpha, gives you a higher return stream than the low active share. But it's just another example. I mean, there are thousands, there are certainly tens of possible ways of adding objectives and constraints to the way that you construct your portfolio. And the way these things all interact to place you in a set of green lines is quite important, right? What are those green lines? Where do those green lines go? After we've worked all that out, then it's like, okay, how do we get onto the right green line? And that's the Sherpa role.
Well, and this active share discussion, I think this ties back to something that it was on a slide that we didn't necessarily talk about. Because again, we got a lot of info today. Fundamentally, when you're making that high active share, low active share decision, or when you're making that low risk, medium risk, high risk decision, you are making a decision or expressing a view on the quality of your alpha, on the quality of your ideas, of your views. And if you are doing your homework, which is something we've talked about in some of our previous understanding your alpha, understanding your idea quality type webinars, if you have a good feeling for that historically, if you have a good feeling for statistically what your alpha looks like, what sort of exposures it has, you can make these informed decisions to say, well, practically speaking, this is about where I want to be on the risk dial. This is about where I want to be on the active return dial. There's a PM I work with who, in this same set of decisions, his higher conviction ideas consistently outperform his lower conviction ideas, and he could move himself up, just like we're doing in this high to low active share, just by blindly, not blindly, right, but statistically blindly putting more weight in his higher conviction ideas. But that's something where he has to have that track record and that confidence in his alpha, that understanding of his alpha, to make that decision to feel comfortable doing it.
Exactly. So, I know that there's a summary, but I just want to say once again, you as a PM who are running money, you are going to be on one of these lines. That's the point. Ex ante, you can define to some extent the width of these possible lines and the, how much of your alpha is in there or not in there by looking at all the various constraints we've talked about today. But your experience will be on one of these lines. And it's really important to think when you're at the beginning of the time period that at the end, this is how you and your LPs are going to experience that time period. The next point, which we've talked about previously, is how to be on the right one of those lines. Understand, if you can, what the impacts of your constraint decisions are. And I say if you can, if you can, you probably want to be able to use some sort of tool to do that. Talk to us, of course, but do think about it in a way which allows you to be slightly more detailed than just a sort of heuristic understanding. I think we all will understand if we increase diversification, we should reduce the width of the spread. But exactly by how much, that's not so clear. How does that interact with the way that we generate alpha? How does that interact with the way that other hard or soft constraints are in place in our portfolio? Those become more and more difficult to get an intuitive heuristic understanding of. Tools like the candidate portfolio approach can really help you with this. So get in touch, let us know how we can help you get a better understanding of your constraints.
Yeah, and so again, if anyone has questions, we're more than happy to take them. If everyone is eyeing their watch because we went a little long, we had a lot to talk about today. And this webinar, this starts to bring together for us a lot of the different elements. Because again, what we talked about in the previous session about assessing individual constraints, does it make sense? Do I have everything that I need to have within the definition? You know, all of the things that go into understanding them. This is how you can then test and sort of refine and fine tune those constraints. All the stuff we talked about understanding your alpha, again, so this is all sort of part of the process of understanding what you're trying to do and what you're good at, setting up the problem to give you the best chance of doing that, and then building a portfolio that is good at delivering that set of outcomes. So again, if anyone has questions or if we've gone too long, certainly feel free to reach out. We have emails here. You're happy to give us an email or call anytime. Otherwise, again, the replay, if you missed part of the session, if you came in late, replay will be up on the YouTube channel later today with all of our other Process Alpha webinars. So by all means, feel free to check those out. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about portfolio construction, to learn a little bit about different ways to think about, you know, how you can improve your portfolio decision-making process. Richard, thanks so much for walking us through all this. Any last final words?
Just thank you very much from me, Stephen, for putting those together and hosting, and thanks all for attending.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and we will look forward to seeing you guys next time.